We had been house hunting for a few months before finally deciding on a place. It was a seemingly average two-story home that was smack dab in the center of a suburban neighborhood. The reason for the move was quite simple. My wife and I wanted our son Hunter to be closer to his school, and as a bonus, it cut down on my commute to work by nearly half. My family quickly got settled into our new home, and for the first couple of months, everything was great. Hunter was doing well in school and seemed to really enjoy the neighborhood. My wife and I also enjoyed the spare time we received from having to travel to work. Overall, it was a great boost to our morale, and brought us closer together as a family. During those initial months, I formed a friendship with some of my neighbors. Our next-door neighbor, Pete, was a large man who could always be found in his yard grilling something up. Him and his wife even invited us over a few times for dinner. Pete and his wife were older, and their kids had long since left the nest, so it was nice for them to share in some social interactions with us. Towards the beginning of summer, something strange occurred in our home. It was a Thursday evening. My wife was in the shower, and I was in the living room watching a bit of television before bed, when Hunter tapped me on my shoulder, nearly sending my heart leaping from my chest. I spun around in a panic, but quickly calmed myself when I realized who it was. I asked Hunter what was wrong, and why he wasn't in bed. He just paused for a few minutes, and I could tell he was searching for the words. My son has always been an extroverted individual, the type of kid that always had something to say, and to see him at a loss for words caught my attention. He said with a hushed voice that he saw something in his closet. Now, Hunter had never mentioned anything like that before. He had never been the type of kid to be afraid of monsters in his closet or under his bed, so to hear him speak about this now was curious. I ruffled his hair and told him that I would go take a look to make sure everything was safe. He timidly followed behind as I sauntered up the stairs into his room. I turned on the lights and gazed around. Everything in his room appeared as ordinary as can be. I opened his closet and looked inside. While it was quite dark in the closet, there wasn't anything unnatural about it. I called Hunter over and we both looked inside. I then patted him on the shoulder and explained that sometimes we see things that aren't truly there, and that our brains make connections and assumptions out of nothing. This meager explanation seemed to reassure him, and he relaxed a bit. I tucked him into bed and wished him a good night, and then I headed to bed myself. At roughly 3:30 in the morning, I felt something touch my shoulder. This sent a jolt throughout my body, snapping me awake. I was so disoriented I couldn't make out what was touching me. I sat up in my bed rapidly and glanced over at my wife. She was still sound asleep peacefully, so I turned to the other side. And when I did, I saw a figure standing near my bed. I rubbed my eyes, and they slowly began to focus despite the low light. It was Hunter. He was standing next to me with a look of uncertainty on his face. Once I realized it was him, I relaxed slightly and laid back down. I asked him what was wrong, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then, with a whisper, he told me that thing was back. Normally, I would have gotten up to investigate, but I was so groggy and disoriented that I told him it was probably nothing, that he just had a bad dream and didn't really see anything. Hunter released a defeated sigh. Then he said something that caught my attention and brought me further from my groggy state. He said that the thing he saw spoke to him. I asked him what it said, and he said that it didn't like me or Mom. I hunched myself up and rose from the bed. I slowly walked with Hunter back to his bedroom and turned on his light. I scanned around the entire bedroom and didn't see anything. I searched under his bed and in his closet. I even checked the window to make sure it was tightly fastened. There was absolutely no sign of anyone or anything in his room. I then sat Hunter down on his bed and sighed. I tried once again explaining that this thing he was seeing was probably just a figment of his imagination, that it wasn't truly there. Hunter nodded with a frown and got back into his bed. I told him to try his best to just ignore it, and eventually it will go away. I wished him good night and returned to my room. It was after that point that things became increasingly stranger. While Hunter was at school and my wife was at work, I began hearing odd noises occurring throughout the house, random footsteps that would echo above my head in the living room. I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing was there. Then, nearly a week and a half later, my wife took Hunter to go visit her parents. It was one of the few times that I was thankful to have to work. Don't get me wrong, I love spending time with my family, but my mother-in-law can be a lot to deal with. I'd gotten off work one day fairly early and decided to get a bit of yard work done, when my neighbor Pete popped his head over the fence. He greeted me and I returned the favor, when he said something odd to me. He asked me if I was having trouble at home, to which I returned a confused look. I told him no and asked why. He paused and thought for a moment and said it wasn't any of his business, but he was outside grilling and mentioned seeing me in the window upstairs appearing very agitated, that I looked to be stomping around and shouting angrily. I asked him when he saw this and he replied only an hour or so ago. I told him no, that I had been relaxing since I had gotten off of work and that my family were currently out of town. He mentioned his eyes must be going in his old age and apologized. I told him think nothing of it, but then he stopped and pointed up to my son's bedroom window. He didn't say anything, but I turned and looked regardless. There was something standing in Hunter's bedroom window. From this distance, I couldn't make out anything, just the shape of a person. I told Pete to wait here for a moment and I made my way inside the house. Upon crossing the threshold into my home, I felt an air of uncertainty. It felt like something in this house definitely did not want me in there. Still, I shook the feeling from my mind and darted up the stairs. I approached Hunter's room and stood outside the door for a few moments. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. I was fully expecting to find an empty room, just as I had all those times Hunter had dragged me in here. As the door creaked open, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Standing there, in the center of the room, was a person made up entirely of darkness. Like a human shadow had peeled itself from the wall and was just walking around. The outline of its body seemed fuzzy, like it was constantly dissipating and reforming. It turned around to face me, and the only thing I could make out for sure on its entire form were its eyes. Cold blue eyes that seemed to give off a faint glow. Before I could even react, this thing hunched forward and let out a static-filled shriek. It was so piercing that I could see the window rattling behind it. I clutched my ears and nearly crumpled to my knees. I somehow managed to brace myself, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw this thing was standing before me. It then stretched out its arms slowly into these massive, four-pronged claws. It then reared its arms backwards, preparing to strike, and I shut my eyes as I felt my time was near. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Slowly, I opened my eyes and I was alone in the room. The entire room was empty, and that feeling I had felt previously had completely vanished. I quickly rushed down the stairs and back outside. Pete was standing there looking at me with a bewildered expression. He asked me if I was all right, and I nodded with ragged breath. I asked him if he saw what had transpired through the window, and he just shook his head. He said he watched me enter the room, and then I walked over to the window and just stared outside for 10 minutes straight. He said he was just about to go inside and contact my wife when I came bursting out of the front door. He said it was the darndest thing, too. He said that he had been watching me in the window, when I suddenly exited from the house. When he looked again, I was no longer in the window. I told him it was nothing to worry about, and I bid him a good night before pulling out my cell phone and calling my wife. I told her to stay at her parents' a few extra days and that I'd be heading out that way shortly. After I arrived at my in-laws, I privately spoke with my wife about moving into a new place. She was taken aback by my sudden desire to leave our new home. However, I was adamant that she trust me on this, and she returned a nod with a quiet smile. During this conversation with my wife, our son Hunter walked into the kitchen and looked at us both. I patted him on the head and told him that we were moving soon. Hunter looked up at me and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" And before I could respond, my wife asked, "Saw what, honey?" Hunter turned to her and replied, "That scary shadow with the cold, blue eyes."